Coercion is evil precisely because it thus eliminates an individual as a thinking and valuing person and makes him a bare tool in the achievement of the ends of another. Welcome to Keith Knight. Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we have James Harrigan. He is the managing director of the Center for Philosophy of Freedom at the University of Arizona and the F.A. Hayek Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. In the links below, you will see his excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion, How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies, and What It Means for Economics and Politics, as well as his podcast, Words and Numbers with Anthony Davies. Mr. Harrigan, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, happy to be here, Keith. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. I was thinking about some of the major concepts in philosophy, and you were the first guy that came to mind. So I want to ask you, what is Plato's Allegory of the Cave?
That's a hell of a question to lead with, Keith. The Allegory of the Cave is a way to start thinking about man's natural condition, how we know what we know, how we know what we think we know, these sorts of questions. And really, it's in Plato's Republic, Book 7. So you can go look it up there if you like. But here's the long and the short of it. Socrates, talking to his friend, says, imagine, if you will, a bunch of people bound at the bottom of a hill in a cave with a bright light source behind them that hits them from behind. And then imagine, if you will, a row in front of those people across which certain things go. And Plato would want you to think about, as different from Socrates, there's always this problem. Is it Plato? Is it Socrates? So let's just stick with Socrates. Socrates pushes on this and says, would those people bound the way they are with their heads pointing straight with the light source behind them, would they perceive reality as it is, or is it something else? Because as these things move behind them, a shadow is cast on the wall in front of them, and they would start taking guesses as to what was happening, right? But all they could see would be the shadows. And then imagine, if you would, that one of them is untied and dragged up above ground. What would happen to him? He would, seeing reality for the first time, be overwhelmed by it. And then he would immediately want to go back down and tell all of his friends what he saw. But of course, he wouldn't want to go back down because he just saw reality. And you notice the strife in his mind that would emerge. And if they compelled him back down the same way they compelled him up, right? These are compulsions. You have to understand that he doesn't want either one of these things to happen. But when they do happen, when he gets back down in the cave, he's going to tell all of his compatriots there what's really going on. And what are they going to say when he does that? And Plato wants you to think, Socrates wants you to think, and I think it's more Plato than Socrates for a reason that will come up in a moment, wants you to think that they would actually be quite angry with him telling them that they see everything incorrectly and that they could see things correctly if they just listened to him. And what would they do? Wouldn't they want to kill him? And that's exactly what happened in the story of Socrates' life. Right? Socrates, the philosopher, was killed by his fellow Athenians for explaining to them what he understood to be true, broadly speaking. So there's Plato's cave for you. And the real question when you think about this is, where do you sit? Are you down below, chained to the earth, looking forward, your head blocked so you can't move left to right? Or are you outside where the sun shines above ground? Because nobody's really above ground here. There's only a couple of people that are up there. The vast majority of all humanity is down in the cave. So how do you start addressing that? How do you start dealing with that when you start asking questions like, how should we live together? Which is the quintessential political philosophy question. How should we live together? What should we do? Because you can't answer that question until you know what the truth is. But here's the kicker. None of us knows what the truth is. All we have is an estimation, a best guess. Some of us study our entire lives trying to figure it out, but there's no way to know that you have, no definitive way. So this is about where we are with the questions and problems of political philosophy. We have to live together. That much is clear. None of us are hermits. but how do we live together? How do we find justice, which seems to be the first question, right? You have to define that before you can live well. And if the allegory of the cave is to be taken seriously, you might never have an answer to that question. We might always be acting on our best guess.
Now, the interesting thing that Plato has about them killing the guy who's able to see the light, able to see the world as it is interesting because today, in a lot of political discourse, when you bring something up to someone, whether you're proving them wrong or not, when you're introducing them to an opposing view that maybe you have done a little more research on, they don't say, "Thank you so much for enlightening me. I'm not even paying you and you're just giving me this information." It's always hostile. Go on social media anytime. It's very hostile. It's very hateful. How do you think Plato had such wisdom to know that people would be so hateful as opposed to, well, they'd be so grateful that you enlighten them?
Well, he had seen it play out in his teacher Socrates' life, right? So I think we can conclude that there's really nothing new under the sun. Technology makes it look a bit different, and there are differences from generation to generation. And I think when we've gotten to the place now where essentially the speed of thought is instantaneous. You can think something wherever you are and tell me about it wherever I am in 1 second. And that's an interesting phenomenon. But really, I don't think we're any different as creatures, right, as human beings, than we would have been in ancient Athens. When I read Plato, the characters in Plato look like people I know. When I read the Old Testament, which is roughly contemporaneous in certain books, the stories and the people I see there are people I know. They're doing things that I understand, right? Not for good most often, right? There's almost an element of nefarious behavior, but I get it. And when I read ancient Indian and ancient Chinese texts, same damn thing. So there's nothing new here. It's just a matter of how we react to it. And I think it's probably sad, more than anything, that we still are so awful to each other. And we are absolutely awful to each other. You hop on social media where you were taking this a minute ago, and you just see it everywhere. People are just dreadful. And who knows, maybe they stay that way. I try to figure out how I can engage them with a little bit of humor, right? A little bit of self-deprecation. Sometimes it works. I don't do as well as my partner, Anthony Davies. He will go with anybody for as long as they want to get his point across. I think the best you can do is just kind of opening people's eyes, going back down in the cave and saying, nope, don't look here, and maybe then walking away. At least that way you don't have to pay a price for it.
I am under the impression, I should have looked this up before, that philosophy is a word that means loosely the love of wisdom. Even if I'm wrong on that, please correct me. And if it does mean, how do you get people to love wisdom as opposed to seeing it as something threatening that is stopping their worldview from being recognized as correct?
Yeah, I don't think you can. I think that the study of philosophy as a life goal, right, to understand what it all means, is reserved for very few people. I don't think most people care. I don't think that you could make them care. And I think it's no accident that Plato offered the allegory of the cave. It's a story, right? Because everybody likes a good story. Very few people want precision in philosophy the way the professional philosophers do. So I trade in stories when I can, right? Somebody gets all agitated and I say, this reminds me of a time. And the older you get, the more you can get away with that kind of crap. So I give it a shot from time to time. And I think the more you can keep things in the realm of storytelling, the better off you are, right? Because most people will not care one whit what Machiavelli said, what Plato said, right? They don't care, and I don't blame them. What they do care about, though, is what's the right answer, what's actually true. And maybe I can help out a little bit there.
Oh, yeah, it's about bringing the horses to water. No guarantee they'll drink, but
that's
you're bringing them. Final question on Plato. Why was Socrates put to death?
corrupting the youth and undermining the gods of the city, which are the kinds of charges that philosophers always face when they look at their fellows, their fellow citizens. It was just too much for them to take, because everywhere Socrates went, he would wander up to somebody and say, hey, then he'd ask a really difficult question. He'd get an answer and he would demonstrate why that answer was incorrect. And he'd say, try again. And he would do this until whoever he was questioning got sick of it and left. And this isn't the way to influence people and win friends, right?
And this was a method of taking the principle and then applying it in a different situation. That's what the heart of the Socratic method is?
Well, the Socratic method is talking things through, that we answer our political questions dialectically, right, in argument, in assertions, and then the giving of reasons to support the assertions. And, as you do that, you're going to be a number of people, and you're going to be more offensive to people who are not part of the philosophical community, for lack of a better word. And they're going to come after you sooner or later. If you don't quit it, they're going to come for you. And fair enough, right? You should know when you've been a pest, and you should know when to dial it down a bit. Socrates couldn't do that. Just couldn't do it. Dispositionally, couldn't do it.
What are the main philosophical contributions of Machiavelli?
Yeah, Machiavelli. Interesting, right? We just mentioned him a second ago. And he fits into this story in a very, very interesting way. Because whereas philosophy is the pursuit of truth, capital T truth, right? Machiavelli looked at everything that had happened before, and that's Plato and it's Aristotle, it's the early Christians. And he said, yeah, not so much. What we really have to concern ourselves with is the effectual truth. Because if you're ruling, as long as what you're doing looks to be in conformity with the truth, who cares? All bets are off. And that makes him, in no small part, the obvious break with the ancients, right? So if you asked, when does modernity begin? Almost every political philosopher will tell you it begins with Machiavelli. I think there's a case to be made for some others, but that's about the consensus pick. And the reason why it's the advent of modernity is because he very casually throws out the idea that the truth is necessary and lands on this effectual truth argument, whereas no matter what you do, as long as it's plausible that it were true, and as long as the people will believe you when you tell them it was true, hey, go ahead, do whatever you need to do. And Machiavelli had a certain kind of violence in his thinking, right? It wasn't what we would call the pursuit of the good. It was the pursuit of power. And that's what makes him such a unique break with the past.
And do you think that is just something that happened in, his time in the 1500s and nothing we can use today? Or is there a lot of wisdom that he can give us today that we could apply to current political leaders or even in our everyday lives with people we deal with?
Yeah, I think there's a ton by way of practical application of Machiavelli. And it's good enough that you might use it even if you know that Machiavelli had no care for what the good was, right, in the language of the ancients. The thing that you've probably heard, and that most of your listeners have probably heard, is that Machiavelli addressed the question of whether it's best to be feared or to be loved, right? And that's an interesting question. And by the way, there's a great movie called A Bronx Tale, which is built right on top of that question. It's Robert De Niro stars in Ches Palminteri. So go look that up, because it does a wonderful job of unpacking this question, whether it's best to be feared or loved. Machiavelli said, all things equal, it's better to be feared. It's best to be loved, but you're going to have to be feared. And if you're feared, that's fine, as long as you're never hated.
Mm.
And that's an interesting gloss on things, right? If you're horrific in your violence, but you can convince the majority of the people not to be frightened of you, but to fear you, right? It's a weird kind of thing. Be feared but not hated. I don't know what that means in the end when you think about politicians and how they usually go about their business. It seems that it's very difficult for them not to be hated, at least by a very significant subset of the whole, right? And think about it in American terms. We've got an election coming up. Well, we've got this 42% or so who are absolutely convinced that Donald Trump is straight from heaven. And then we've got another 44% or so who seem to think that Biden is just the thing. He's just wonderful. And that leaves us with a fair number in the middle, people like me, actually, who look at them both and say, I can't stand either one of you clowns. And it starts to feel like hatred.
Yeah, I would assume that if you are hated, then you would more or less lose public opinion, just as, the King of France did, just as King George III did in America. That does remind me of A Bronx Tale, where, he beats up all the bikers in the bar and everyone's
It's
on
my
his
favorite
side
scene in the movie.
because
Absolutely
they
my favorite.
disrespected him. And then when people in the town see that those guys are getting beaten up, the mobsters are loved so much they start chasing after the bikers and beat them down and mess up with their bikes. So that whole loved and feared thing, I definitely see in mob movies today.
Yeah, and in that movie, the lead character, Charles Palminteri, the actor played the lead character, he actually talked about, he said, Machiavelli said this hundreds of years ago. And when you see him talking about Machiavelli in the middle of a movie, you realize, okay, this has weathered the test of time. This is an important question to be studying, because here we are all these years later, from the 16th century, all these years later, I don't know that we have a particularly good rebuttal of the assertion. I think politically, he might be absolutely right.
So is a possible way to not be tricked by the Machiavellian politicians of the world maybe to look at what they say and then look at what they do, or just look at what they say and use the Socratic method? Any ideas on how we can combat this Machiavellian mindset that unfortunately is still with us?
Well, yeah, it's tough, right? It's going to require some paying of attention and some analysis. And I think people aren't typically up for that sort of thing. They don't want to live their entire lives thinking about whether a politician is lying to them or not. And I can't say I blame them. I don't want to think about that either. The short answer is the politicians are all lying. We all know this, but it's a matter of degree, right? And if you take a look at what people say, I don't think you get most of the way home. I think you really want to see the revealed preferences. What do they do? Just put what they say aside completely. And that's the hard part, right? People only want to pay attention to the verbalization of what the politician wants to accomplish. And here I come saying, no, just only pay attention to what they do. Well, look at what that would give you right now. Donald Trump said a lot of things 4 years ago. Was he telling the truth? What are the revealed preferences over the 4 years? What do you see him doing? And it's a radically different thing than what he said, or even indeed what he now says. But he said all kinds of things. My personal favorite was that he was going to, in 8 years, eliminate the federal debt, which anybody who understands math knows that's nonsense. But okay, how did he do? Well, he took the debt from 19 trillion to 27 trillion. Obviously not a big concern. And that's the revealed preference, right? It doesn't matter what he said, it matters what he did. And so too with every other issue.
What are the main philosophical contributions of John Locke?
Yeah, Locke. Locke is probably the philosopher that most people almost know but really don't, right? Is what we became after the Enlightenment was so Lockean that everybody kind of knows it, even if they've never read a word, right? And we talk about the second treatise with Locke almost always. And Locke says, Locke wants you to do this thought experiment instead of a cave. He says, imagine, if you will, human beings living in a state of nature. And what the hell is a state of nature? It's simply a place with no government and no authority. And Locke says, how would people behave in this state of nature? And he draws it out a bit But the first thing that you realize is that it's going to be a tough go, right? Without some kind of infrastructure, it's going to be difficult because everybody's going to have to do everything in a solitary sort of way. So how do you get your food? I don't know. Good luck to you, right? He uses an example of apples falling off a tree, and so presumably everybody's eating apples. But he wants to know how people would deal with one another in this state of nature, and if they could get out of it in some sort of collective action. And he opines that, well, people wouldn't necessarily be terrible to each other. They might be, but not as a rule. Maybe. I think that comports well with what I know of human beings. Some become quite abusive or violent from time to time, but the vast majority of people don't. They're actually pretty decent. And Locke says, oh, all right, well, if they're pretty decent and they live in this state of nature, then really what we're going to want to do is get them out of the state of nature so they can live better. And that seems about right. Because how do we live better? We live better when we all live together and we follow rules and there's division of labor and this sort of thing. So Locke says really what should happen is people should come together and they should sign on to a social contract. And that social contract, in the end, means that they give away or they give up a little tiny slice of their rights to the collective. So do you have the right to self-defense? Man, maybe. Do you have the right to vigilantism? No. No, you do not. Not after that contract is signed, right? And it's this sort of thing. Do you have an absolute right to all your property? Well, no, not all of it. We're going to have some taxes, right? Things like this. But for the most part, it's a better deal than it was in the state of nature. So, of course, every rational being will make it. They'll make that deal. They'll make it every time. Because if we're all working together and we don't have any obvious problems with each other, well, that would be a lot better. And, you know, he talks about all kinds of other things as well. He talks about money and how money really is our guarantee against spoilage. So back to the apple tree, you can pick up as many apples as you want, but you can't eat them all and they're going to spoil. Meanwhile, if you labor and pick them all up and then sell them to your fellow citizens for whatever the market price would be for an apple or two, well, there is no spoilage anymore. But that wealth needs to be maintained somehow, and we maintain it in the form of coinage. Right? It all makes perfect sense. There's nothing really all that crazy here. But that Locke brought it all together in the 17th century is quite astonishing. And he brought it all together in such a way that we still more or less refer to ourselves in his terms. And it's not a surprise when you realize that Jefferson was one of the founders, very Lockean in his orientation. And we get our Locke here in the United States largely through Jefferson. So to the extent we still think of Thomas Jefferson and we abide by whatever wisdom he had, we're probably actually scratching on the surface of Locke every single time. And it's amazing how this goes over generations, right?
Do you think the ideas of John Locke are sort of the catalyst as to what made people stop recognizing the legitimacy of monarchs and more so only the legitimacy of representatives who are first elected by the populace at large?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And once upon a time, I put Locke on that pedestal. And I said, everything we got from him. Until I read some of the work by a couple of guys named Heinemann and Lutz, and they had done a sweep of the primary documents of the American Revolution and the period up to about the Constitution. And what they did was they took all the citations of every single person in every single document they could find. They just categorized them all. And what you find is that in the early part, in the revolutionary part of American history, Locke barely comes up. Barely comes up. Who does? Blackstone and Cook, two jurists. Okay, that's in the revolutionary period. What about in the constitutional period? Now it's Montesquieu, not Locke. When Locke gets here, it's through Jefferson. It's through people. You can see it pretty clearly, but you can also see, if you do a scan of the literature, that his name isn't coming up all that much. Another one who didn't come up all that much, Adam Smith. who published in 1776. It seems that something was going on about that time, right? And yet you never hear of Adam Smith on this side of the Atlantic. So when we think about Locke, do we think about kings? Yeah, I think always, because the Second Discourse is written against this idea of the divine right of kings, right? That human beings are in fact equal. And that's one of the things you get out of Locke. You get it out of Hobbes, too, who wrote a little bit prior. But with Hobbes, people were all equal because, as Hobbes said, any one of us could kill any of the rest of us. And this is a typically Hobbesian point of view. It's always really low in terms of where he situates human nature. Locke was more high-minded about it. He left open the possibility that we might kill each other. And you could argue that that creates a condition in which there's no functional difference between Locke and Hobbes. I'm a little sympathetic to that, but I think there is nonetheless a difference between them. Locke is more charitable. He says that life in the state of nature wouldn't be terrible. It would just be something that could be improved upon. Whereas Hobbes said in the state of nature, the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He was a man with very strong opinions, you see. Locke less so, right? I think Locke seems to think that human beings are actually kind of decent. And we can bring Rousseau in here because Rousseau was also a state of nature theorist. And in his state of nature, he asks the very obvious question. Locke and Hobbes assume quite a big thing. But here comes Rousseau to ask, well, if we're in a state of nature, how exactly did language emerge? Isn't that a collective thing? And he's, of course, absolutely right. There is no language if we've never lived together. And Rousseau says, look, in a state of nature, people are going to be quite foreign to one another. But if there is one thing we can say, it's that if I, James, were walking outside somewhere and I saw you, Keith, on the ground, a broken leg, I would have an empathetic response to that. I think that's about right. Right. So in a lot of ways, Rousseau is the more honest of the state of nature theorists. But here's the thing with state of nature theory in a nutshell. And it's something that the anarchists are always keen to point out, and I'll point it out too. I never signed any agreement at all. I was never party to a contract. I was born here. That's how I got here. We didn't all gather under a tree somewhere and sign a piece of paper. So, if there's no such thing as a social contract, why are we so insistent on talking about a social contract? And you find that it's one of those things that people love to do when they think they can bend it to their ends. But when their opposition does the same thing, they cry foul.
Now, it seems like almost everyone agrees to some sort of social contract. Even, the voluntarists will even say there is a social contract. You should not initiate aggression against anyone. Other people say there's a social contract. When the government tells you to do something, you have to obey. So do you see that the social contract as something that more or less people just disagree on what the terms are? Or is there a competing ideology that does not consist of any social contract or general understanding amongst humans living in society?
Let's section off that last part, humans living amongst one another. Let's just leave that off to the side. I think there is a very strong point of view that looks at social contract theory and says that's nonsense. I'm one of them, right? So Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Montesquieu in the Persian Letters, even John Rawls in closer to our own time, all social contract thinkers to one degree or another. But they all say the same thing. They say, look, what I'm going to talk about next has never happened and will never happen. But I'm going to use it to think through the problems of power and authority. Fair enough, right? I don't think it gets you very far in practical living, but it does shed some light on a couple of things. What does get you somewhere in terms of how we live together? Well, in a lot of ways, I find myself more with each passing year saying that I'm an Aristotelian, right? And Aristotle said very simply, man is a social animal. And I've seen no upgrade to that comment in 2,000 years. In 2,000 years, that comment catches more of everything than anyone else. Man is a social animal. Well, what does that mean? It means first, you're born into a family. After that, your family collects into a household. Your household, a neighborhood, the neighborhood, a polis. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, what do you have to contend with wherever you are, wherever you're living? Tradition. The one thing that nobody ever talks about. Everybody wants to talk about the novel thing and the new idea. Well, that's all well and good, but sadly, you're bound by your traditions, which means if you're born in the United States, you're going to have one batch, and if you're born in Mexico, another. So too every other country on the face of the planet. Some more conformably than others, right? So I always tell students, look, I can get on an airplane and go anywhere in the Western world, get off that plane, take a look around, and know just what to do. So if I get to England, if I get to Scotland, if I go to Australia, if I go to France, if I go to Spain, no problem. You grab another batch of countries, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, a lot of stands here, I guess, or my old home in Iraq. Well, now it's not going to be so clear. They clearly have customs. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And it's probably easier to see them in a foreign place, right? Because when everything's radically different, you see with fresh eyes. But wherever I go, well, now it's not the same. Tradition matters, and you have to understand it before you can dismiss it out of hand. It's kind of like the rules of good writing, right? First, you have to know those rules, and you have to follow them. Then you can break them judiciously when you really need to. Well, so too political things. These traditions matter, right? If I'm going to start agitating in the United States for a communist party, wouldn't it be sensible for me to look into whether there has ever been a communist party here? Right? What do the traditions allow? Where are our leftist leaning places? How do they compare with those in the rest of the world? These are all tradition questions I've got to ask. And I think, frankly, you get a lot further asking questions like this. You can actually understand more.
I would consider Thomas Sowell's book, A Conflict of Visions, to be in the philosophical realm with regard to traditions, where he says human beings have knowledge that is extremely dispersed. So, in order to act properly, they mostly go off traditions, considering they have limited knowledge. So they say, I'm one person in a world of billions, and I have so little knowledge. I've only had 2 jobs. I've spoken to only people in my town. So I'm going to delegate my reasoning. So yeah, the importance of custom and tradition, I definitely see. Do you have any ideas as to how to make sure that, we as people trying to be rational can make sure we're not subject to only traditions and make sure we're sort of thinking out of the box critically, as opposed to just being victims of where we were geographically born into?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you use the word victims here, right? Because everybody wants to be a victim now. It's like the victim
Poor choice of
Olympics.
words for the modern
Yeah,
day, but
yeah, and
I meant like victim of
I get it.
circumstance, not like, oh, poor me.
Yeah, I get it. It's just kind of strange how we've become a nation of victims crying out to be bigger victims, right? Um, I think you're far better off not going down that road and dealing with life as it comes, but each to his own. I don't know if there's an easy way out here. I wish there were. I don't know that there is. And I think many of the problems that we're seeing right now hinge on questions like this. And I think they more or less fall back to lousy parenting, right? Because you can see a difference generation to generation. And for a couple, it's been pretty grim. And all of a sudden, it's kind of getting a little better. And I may have my finger on this pulse a little better because, of course, I have children in their teens. I go and visit high schools every year, and I go and visit colleges every year. So you get a nice smattering, a cross section of what things look like. And life changed at some point, and it was poorly dealt with for a while. And all of a sudden, it's getting a little better. I don't hear the woe is me nonsense all that much. I hear it from 45-year-old academics who want to get themselves into, some sort of victimology status. But, with young people becoming adult, I don't see it at all. I see them actually, the generation of teenagers now, probably more opportunistic, more entrepreneurial than I've seen in a long time. So I'm feeling kind of good about where they might be. And when you ask, is there anything we can do? I think the answer to that is always kind of no, for reasons that Tom Sowell would be happy to hear, because it's just too much, right? When we see generationally things getting better or worse, that's that's more or less a natural occurrence. It's an emergent phenomenon, right? That people take to their lives in such a way and define those lives in such a way that there's no space at all for any one of us to do that, right? It's not like I can get up on a mountain and come around the mountain with the 10 commandments or some such thing and say, here you go, everybody, do these things. It just doesn't work that way, right? But how does it work? Well, people are born, raised by their parents, they go to school, they live in communities. For crying out loud, I'm sounding just like Aristotle. It's the exact same thing. And sometimes those groups of people come up with remarkably stupid ideas, and they last for a little while and then they go away. Intersectionality comes to mind immediately, right? This is just a world built on sand. It's a world of nonsense. And you can't tell that to any 45, 50-year-old academic right now. But I can say that to an 18-year-old kid, and he's going to look at me and say, yep, that's right. Because he's got his own life plan, and it doesn't land on being a victim. Good enough, right? We're going to have to live with it for a while, but we have to live with stupid ideas all the time. I mean, look, in the 1970s, bell bottoms and disco were all the fad, right? And then by
That
the 80s, that was gone. Thank God in heaven. And there's just going to be another stupid thing, right? That by the 90s, it was flannel. I don't know what it is now. I see a bunch of guys wearing dresses on the fashion shows, but I don't meet them in my real life. There's all kinds of superficial things that you can read as being tremendously stupid. And yeah, sure, of course, of course. I'm guessing that probably a third of everything I do is bone-chillingly stupid. Right, but
Before
I'm not gonna know for a while. That's the thing.
it takes a while to process. Any final words before we move on from Rousseau on either the social contract or the discourse on inequality? Because
Uh,
the reason I bring it up is just because I feel like maybe I'm looking too much into it. I feel like a lot of the inequality discussion today is so Rousseauian motivated from what I remember, but I'd have to think out the argument a little more.
yeah, no, and I think working with that material, I taught a class on Rousseau once, 16 weeks of only Rousseau, and I don't think we did him justice. In 16 weeks, I think there was a lot more left to say. How the hell can that be the case, right? I can't talk about one thing for 16 weeks ever, but I did it with him, and I think I did him a disservice in a lot of ways. It was a great class. I loved it, but he was a complicated guy.
What are the main philosophical contributions of John Rawls?
He came up a little while ago. I'm not the biggest fan of Rawls. Rawls hit the political philosophy stage for real in the 80s, give or take, and he became, over just a few years, probably the most influential political philosopher since the Enlightenment. I think that's fair enough to say. And Rawls, and remember how state of nature theory worked, right? We talked about that a little bit. We're going to talk about it again because Rawls offers a modified state of nature theory. So if you think state of nature theory is bunk, you're probably like me going to think this is bunk too. But it's interesting in what you can conceive of in this way. Because Rawls said, okay, imagine a place where you know what it means to be disabled, smart, stupid, black, white, every detail of human life. You know it. But also assume that you have no idea which of those character traits you have. You just know that some people are disabled. Some people are really smart. You don't know if you're one of any of them. And he says, okay, behind this, what he calls the veil of ignorance, what kind of state would you design? What would your politics look like? And that's actually interesting, right? Because it takes you, the human, out of the equation. Now you're just you, the intellect. And what you decide behind the veil of, that's likely to be just. And anything you decide knowing the particulars of your life, very likely to be unjust. Now, I love that idea. I think he's exactly right. Of course, the problem here is that there's no way to make that happen. It's a mental exercise. You can think about what it would be like, but you can't call that into being, right? We all know what we are at every moment of the day, and we know the things that hamper our life plans, and we know the things that help our life plans. So you're never going to get very far down this road, but it seems to me to be absolutely true that this approach would yield the most just outcome because the state would be designed for everyone, right? Things would be taken into account that we don't account for now. So on that level, I have to say, hats off to John Rawls. In the large, I have to say, well, it is interesting, but definitionally, we'll never get there. And doesn't saying we should do something imply that it should be possible, that ought implies can. And yeah, I think so. Rawls did give us a way of thinking about things that we didn't have previously. And for that, I think it's incredibly beneficial. I'm able to think about these things a little differently. Will it ever bring about a different kind of result? Now I don't know. And it's just state of nature theory differently construed. And if I'm on record as saying all state of nature theory is bunk, why? Because I didn't sign a contract. Well, I didn't sign one with Rawls either. So we're back to that point. And do any of the state of nature theorists bring us further than Aristotle did? And I don't think they did. I think Aristotle wasn't concerned with things like freedom for everybody, right? He just wasn't. His world was very comfortable with slavery, for example. He wrote a lot about how you have to treat slaves. So, okay, it's not our world, but the observation holds. Man is a social animal. And I could probably learn more about men by reading history books than by reading philosophy books. And isn't that curious? It kind of is, right? Philosophers tend not to think that way, but maybe they should.
Oh, yeah. Now, if I take the Rawlsian veil of ignorance and apply it to the excellent book that you co-wrote with Anthony Davies, Cooperation and Coercion, How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies, and what that means for economics and politics, I think you could almost come to a drastically different conclusion than Rawls did. So, for example, I'm in a veil of ignorance. I could be, worst comes to worst, I'm disabled. Well, certainly I would want to live in a society that values cooperation, where people are constantly cooperating, increasing the amount of products and services that even a disabled person has access to today. I mean, if you have a state that says there must be assistance for the disabled, that doesn't increase the amount of wheelchairs any more than writing "solve poverty is now illegal" increases the amount of wealth within society. So do you see how, do you think looking at Rawls, you can actually come to the same conclusion you and Professor Davies come to?
I think, because look, Ant and I, we've been working together for quite some time, and I think we have very common understanding, very, very common beliefs about how things ought to be, right? If we had that ability, we criticize people with their magic wand theories, right? That you can just say there ought to be a law, and then you wave your magic wand, and there is a law, and that law actually solves a problem without causing all kinds of other problems. So, Ant and I were clearly writing in the contemporary period. We are contemporary figures, and yet our thinking, in some respects, is patently ancient. Patently ancient. And I would suspect that we are more Aristotelian than Hobbesian, right? That if you took Hobbes and Machiavelli and said, okay, these are the two guys that really kicked modernity off, I would prefer to live in an Aristotelian world than in a Hobbesian, Machiavellian world. And that's kind of interesting if you think about it. But Aristotle never for a second thought there was no truth available to you, right? With great effort, you could figure it out. And with eyes and ears, you could probably figure out how to approximate it just by watching what people do. Hobbes and Machiavelli, on the other hand, they offer Machiavelli specifically offers the effectual truth, which means that really all we have to have is a strong figurehead who will lead us by lying to us. I'm not impressed. This doesn't seem to be a great idea. Now, I think you get all the way to the American founding, and you can see modern thought coming into focus with one another. And indeed, Jefferson saw it that way. He who did he cite? Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Algernon Sidney. He said this is what informed the Declaration of Independence. And Locke and Sidney are two moderns for him. And Aristotle and Cicero were two ancients. And what did they all share in common? They were all Republican theorists. And isn't that interesting? That you can find some overlap if you look at it this way. But do you really want to live in Hobbes's world? Machiavelli's world? I know I don't. I know there's no way you could put lipstick enough on that pig to make it worth having, right? So, and that's where we're left, because for those of us who live now, our challenge is figuring out how best to live now. And we've got a lot of things impinging upon us from every direction. We need to try and understand them as best we can before we start shooting off our mouths about how people should live. Because every time you do that, some people end up dying, right? And so a lot more end up being terribly inconvenienced by the governmental forces that impinge upon them.
How do you look from a philosophical point of view at previous generations that seem to be so enlightened yet so unable to apply their own principles consistently? The biggest example is Thomas Jefferson writing about men being created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, meanwhile having a slave owner, George Washington, leading a tax revolt and then engaging in the whiskey collection tax, or Christopher Columbus. How do you, as a philosopher, try to think about, were they just evil opportunists, or were they really good people who were just unable to apply their own principles consistently because they didn't have access to DuckDuckGo?
Yeah, I'm gonna leave Christopher Columbus off to the side because everybody's really pissed at him right now. It was Columbus Day a couple of days, maybe a week ago. So I think it profits us nothing at all to talk about him.
But to talk about Jefferson's a great example, I think.
Yeah, I think Jefferson's the best example, actually, because in the Declaration, he wrote the sentence that changed history. He wrote the most powerful sentence ever written. That's a hell of a thing to say about somebody. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yeah. Every single revolutionary movement from Jefferson's time to the present has latched onto that sentence. Think about that for a second. I'm talking about communist revolutions, gender revolutions, no matter how you want to frame it up. There's Jefferson standing right in the middle of all of it. And yet we know for a fact that he did not free his own slaves. And that is an indictment. There's no question. That's an indictment. But I want to make this a little more complicated, because in one of Jefferson's letters, He said, slavery in our midst is like having a wolf by the ears in the forest. What do? Do you take your hands off the wolf? Because if you do, he'll devour you. Or do you keep on holding the wolf? Because if you do, you'll get tired. You'll let him go and he will devour you. And that was what Jefferson thought slavery would yield here. I get that. That's actually a sensible thing to believe. Had I been a slave, I don't think I could have let it go. I don't think I could have made peace with it the way that many, if not most, slaves did. It's astonishing to me when I see human beings and their capacity to forgive. I think about Nelson Mandela in South Africa, right? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people come and say, I did this. They tell the truth and then they're allowed to leave, go on with their lives again. So Jefferson, in the Constitution, there was a sunset clause. Congress could not legislate against slavery until a certain point in time. Well, that certain point in time turned out to overlap with Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And on the day they were able constitutionally to legislate against slavery, they did. And it hit Thomas Jefferson's desk and he signed it. That was his goal. He signed the first piece of anti-slavery legislation that went through the United States Congress. We don't remember that about him. We don't remember that he thought it was a losing bet no matter what. We just blame him for getting it wrong on a very meaningful level. I can forgive him that to a point. I guess maybe you don't forgive it, you don't overlook it, but you strive to understand it. And I understand where he was coming from. There was no way at a certain point in our history to even think about freeing all the slaves. There was just no way. It would have cost us what was known as the unanimous Declaration of Independence, right? It would have been probably 2, maybe 3 countries instead of 1. And if you ended up there, would slavery ever have been outlawed? Well, it would have taken a lot longer. And even as it went, it took us a civil war, the price we paid in blood for our original sin. What more can you say about it, right? This is just what it was. It was the price we paid in blood for our original sin.
Now, Niall Ferguson says that, yes, there was slavery, there was Native American mass murders very frequently. All of these terrible negative things that are said about America and the West are the least original things about the West. So are we really bringing something to the table to say, oh, they were a bunch of racist slave owners? It's like, okay, everyone throughout all of humanity here's where they improved, it's hard to stand on the shoulders of giants when there's not that many around to stand on.
Well, to answer that question in the most direct way, the way I answer it to America's harshest critics, who tend to be Americans, this is what I have to say to them. Maybe it'll work for you as well. I don't know, but the United States did not invent slavery. Slavery is actually mankind's de facto position. We have had slavery from as far back as we have records. The very first law code that we have, actually, it's a little scrap of a larger law code. What is it about? How you have to treat your slaves. So as far as the laws of nations and times and places, all the laws go, they all somehow dealt with slavery. Now, American slavery was different. It was chattel slavery. Greek slavery would have been who conquered who in the last war, right? So you could literally be in Greece a princess one day and a slave the next, given how the battle went. So it's not the same animal, right? But that's interesting too. We've got all kinds of different slavery. And okay, fine. Here we have the United States with slavery at the founding, a founding dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's really bad. And yet, 70 years later, it was over with. Think about that. It's the natural fallback position of the human race for thousands of years. America's founded, and 7 years later, it's over. Amazing. England beat us to the punch by a little bit. So they had done away with slavery before we did. By the time England and the United States do away with it, it's really not safe anywhere. Where do you find it now? Not in the Western world, you don't.
Oh, certainly. Certainly not the institutionalized recognition of slavery. Yeah, of course, there are kidnappings, there are slave farms, which I'm familiar with those. But about the institutionalized recognition, I remember Camille Foster was on a panel, and they were like, we have to, recognize America's past with slavery. And he goes, yeah, it's not really fair to pin slavery on America, considering it's about as old as writing. And that was just such a funny way to put it, because it's like, yeah, it's like saying, that Asians steal. It's like, yes, Asians steal, but so do whites and blacks and Mexicans. Well, why are you just pinning it on that? That's just you being intentionally divisive in an unproductive way. Yeah, but Asians steal, You're not bringing anything to the table that's literally like saying Americans have slaves, or America was racist, or is racist, or institutional, all this nonsense.
It's become rather fashionable, right? I meet young people, 14, 15, 16 years old. I meet them often, and they legitimately think that the Americans invented the institution of slavery.
The former vice presidential candidate, Tim Kaine, said, when we came to America in Virginia, we brought over slaves. We didn't inherit slavery. We invented it. That was Tim Kaine, the former vice presidential candidate to Hillary Clinton. So, yeah, I don't know if I thought that, but I would have been curious to ask. It'd be curious to ask myself in middle school. When did slavery start? About 1700s, I think I would have said. And that's just incredible. Not because they ever said this is when it started. It said the thing about America is slavery and Native American mass murder. It's like what you're implying is the unique thing is this, when, as Niall Ferguson correctly says, it's the least unique thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And whenever you witness base human behavior, you should understand it for what it is. It's part of human nature. And if you see it in one place, you're probably going to see it in almost every place, because human nature is that kind of thing that it's very difficult to overcome it. Now, I think we have in a number of ways throughout human history, and when we do, it's to be celebrated. Right? It's a big deal, for example, that the United States one day woke up and said, we can't do this anymore. Now, they had a war to sort it out. The bloodiest war in human history until its time. But look at what had to happen to even have that, to have a war about it. You had to have enough people saying, all right, it's worth our looking into this and it's worth our fighting for it. And we really paid a hell of a price for that.
Certainly the abolitionists risking their lives, not exactly the most popular thing. To talk to people now about holding the wolf by the ears, deciding whether or not to let it go. What I think of now, this might be a whole nother discussion, but the research I've done, and I make the case for this in a video titled Why They Hate Us, intentionally provocative, that if you look at the writings of a lot of jihadis, the reason they want to more or less wage war against the West is because since the early 90s, there were terrible sanctions on Iraq that killed a large number of civilians. They then were motivated, bin Laden's 1998 fatwa, between that and the alliance with Israel that killed a number of Muslims, that, well, this is why we're waging war against the U.S. So people that justify a lot of civilians getting killed in the war on terror and not getting much about it except more terrorists that are created, it's hard to say, well, yep, let's bring them all home. Well, we've pissed off a lot of people over there. So, the fact that today people justify war and mass murder should make you a little less uppity about judging Thomas Jefferson when, he was at a time where there was still this conflict. Do you think there's any correlation, or is there nothing there?
Well, I mean, you're looking for some sense in history, right, as it plays out, and some consistency in how we evaluate different claims. And that gets really tough. I mean, it gets really tough. And, you know, in my life, I've seen it firsthand. I went and lived in Iraq for a bit. And, you know, everybody was just actually kind of nice to me. They were kind of sweet. Did they want the Americans out? No, not the people I lived with. Absolutely not. They didn't. The Arabs in the south of the country, they absolutely wanted Americans out. And, you know, it depends on who you ask every time. And everything is much more complicated than people want it to be, right? They want slogans to work. Taxation is theft. Oh, sit down a minute. No, it's not, right? Just give me a break. But taxation is absolutely necessary in a constitutional republic. Why? Because some things have to be paid for. Well, you're going to have to tax someone somewhere, something to do that. It's a matter of degree. It's a matter of nuance, right? At some point, taxation becomes confiscatory and it shouldn't be tolerated. I don't know where that point is. We all have our opinions, right? The anarchists would say 0.1%. I might say 20. I don't know. We got to think that one through. So to this idea of how we're to understand history, I'm not willing to say that history gets written by the victors, but of course I think there's something in that that's exactly correct. History gets written by a lot of people, a lot of different perspectives, and you can never really understand anything that's happened in the past perfectly. It's always more or less, right? I can understand this more if I study it more. Or I could just let it go right now and say, well, I guess this is what I know. And, you know, I think I've been curious as a rule since I was a boy. It's just my nature. Somebody says, this is how it is. And my first question was always, why? And they would hand me books and I would read them. And before you know it, you're a professor, right? That's just the series of events that happens. A lot of people aren't all that curious. They just want to live their lives and go bowling. They don't want to think about politics and philosophy. And I can't say I blame them. I don't want to go bowling, and I'm sure they don't want to read the things I've been reading. Fair enough. Everybody should be free enough to make their choice. Defend that to my dying breath. And that also means that I have to contend with a lot of people who don't care. Okay, don't care. Don't expect me to take you terribly seriously when there's a decision to be made. But go ahead and do what you want, right? And that's as close as I can get to what's right, best, true, and just. It's sloppy. There's no precision here. Literally none. So we're going to fight about it. I think the ancients were right. The truth does emerge through a dialectic, through the assertion and the giving of reasons. And if we do that with each other in charitable terms, we usually do pretty well. It's when we stop being charitable towards each other, kind of like right now in an election cycle, where everybody's calling everybody else a name. It's really brutal. But I suspect that not November 4th, because we won't know who the next president will be until probably the end of December, beginning of January, given all the counting issues that we're likely to have. But we'll get back to normal soon, and people will be decent to each other again. 4 years later, it'll all pop up again. So, I mean, look, you know that this is going to happen. This is just what we do.
But that's what was such a great point. How busybodies became busy bullies. It's like I don't want to fight with. And the state now gets $4 trillion a year in coercive funding, and it's like, all right, well now James, you're going to screw me if you get a hold of this thing. So now I'm going to get a hold of it, and you and I are going to go to the mat about who gets to control this stinking.
Seems exactly right somehow. That seems exactly
agencies.
The way this crap happens. That's right. What a terrible situation we find ourselves in. Thank God it will be all different in a month.
Yeah. And then it's countdown to the next 4 years. And I want to do a 2-minute, just a couple minutes of a role play where you show us how the Socratic method can be used. I still think that's one of the best ways to. So if you want to either explain it or say something to me, and I'll try and be the average Joe that Socrates is trying to discuss at the Agora, please.
Probably easier just to explain it, really. It is my teaching style. It's generally how I do things. I get very bored when I lecture. Walking around saying things is really boring. Walking around and asking a bunch of people questions they can't answer, that's where the happiness resides. So I would typically, just to pull an example that we've been using, I would walk in, I'd say, hello, everyone, how are you? Please pull out your Declaration of Independence. There are some things here I think maybe we should talk about. So what's the underlying thought? What's that main thought that goes through this thing? And sooner or later, somebody's going to say that all men are equal and that somehow we attach governance to this. And I would say, yes, that's exactly right, Pumpkin. Good for you. What about the rest of all the words in here? Why on earth were these indictments against King George separated right after the first two paragraphs, which set it up theoretically? Why then do they jump into a laundry list of complaints against a king that you probably know nothing about? And then I get dead silence. Right, dead silence. So, well, okay, maybe we should go back to the beginning, seeing that's the part that everybody's interested in. How do we get to the point where we take a slave owner seriously when he says all men are created equal? That seems a little odd, doesn't it? And, people are going to answer that question in a very typical way, and they're going to tell me what a gruesome beast Jefferson was, at which point I'll agree with them. I'll say, well, that's probably right. But here's what gets really interesting. Because if you look at those indictments against the king, they go from least serious to most serious. There's a rank order in that list. And you probably don't know this, but Jefferson wrote the rough draft of the Declaration. It was a piece of committee work. It was Jefferson and Ben Franklin and a bunch of other guys, Roger Livingston. There were 5 of them at any rate. And they decided that Thomas Jefferson, then 33 years old for crying out loud, should go write the first draft, which he did. But on Jefferson's first draft, there's a difference, a critical difference. There was a deleted indictment against King George at the very end of the list, which means it was most important. And that deleted indictment blamed the institution of slavery in America on the king and said in no uncertain terms that slavery was an abomination. So here we have a slave owner writing a Declaration of Independence to be given to a king who used the final slot, the slot for the most terrible indictment against the king. He took his argument there. So, was he a hypocrite? Yeah, probably. Was he a genius? Yep, that too. Did he really think that slavery was a positive good? Clearly he didn't. And that's where we're left. That's where our shared inquiry begins. We don't end there, we start there. And from here, we have to read Jefferson rather charitably. We have to understand the context in which the Declaration was written, and we have to understand what came next and why. And when you can get there, then we'll have some knowledge. Until then, we do not. And that's how my classes generally go. Probably every one of them.
Sure. Mr. Harrigan, thank you so much. Again, please check out Cooperation and Coercion, as well as the podcast Words and Numbers. Both of those links will be in the description below. Thank you for watching, Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone, Mr. Harrigan. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Keith. It's always a great time. Looking forward to seeing you again.